Vickers began as a means of gathering military intelligence, but its applications in the world of law enforcement are proving extremely promising in several different areas. These are areas which you will be involved in your studies, and as you've been advised, they're classified top secret and confidential.
When I was working at SRI, I actually didn't know about a lot of the operational work that was going on. I didn't know that there were remote viewers housed at Fort Meade Army Base actually doing this psychic spying. I only knew about the scientific work that was going on.
There were 5 of us, you know. The most skilled technical remote viewers on Project Icarus.
In 1978-79, we were trying to expand our program beyond the psychics that we had worked with. And the government wanted us to determine how widespread this ability was. We interviewed 30 intelligence officers at Fort Meade from Army Intelligence, and we chose 6 people to work with, and we taught those 6 people how remote viewing works, which is of course quite easy to teach. And then at the end of a week working with us, each of those 6 people would go back to Fort Meade, and they taught a large number of other people how to do remote viewing.
I got transferred to Fort Meade, Maryland, to work in a job that was an intelligence-related job that had something to do with the Middle East. And I happened to move in next door to the operations officer across the street from one of the sources, and they would not tell me what they did. And usually, even in you know, the clandestine intelligence world, one intelligence officer pretty well knows what somebody else does. They may not know the specifics, but they know if they're into human intelligence or signals intelligence. And these guys I couldn't get anything out of. And so they said, we're in this special access program. We think you might be a good candidate for what we do. We would like to give you some tests, some psychology tests, some personality assessment tests, and so on, to see how well you would fit in our group. But we can't tell you what we're doing yet. I said, okay. So I took the test, and they said, congratulations, you passed. Now here's what we do. We collect intelligence against potential foreign threats using a parapsychology skill known as remote viewing. We basically want you to be a psychic spy.
You know, I used to be in law enforcement too.
Is that right?
Uh-huh, the FBI. Of course, that was some years ago now. PsyOps, strictly classified.
The primary interest the government had in funding our program was to spy on the Russians. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We demonstrated that we could provide intelligence information that couldn't be obtained in any other way. Now, before they would ever act on any information we provide, because we don't actually know how ESP works, before the government would act on any information we provided, they would look to confirm it from some other source. So they would always want multiple sources rather than just what a bunch of California psychics say. But we could lead them in the right place.
A typical case would be, there's a picture that we got from a spy satellite of something which was not completely certain. And they would then task a remote viewer to go to where this picture points and tell us what's going on there. And so I saw one example after the other. Most are still classified, so I can't talk about it. But what they could see, the story develops, is nobody knows, at least on our side, nobody knew what this was. The remote viewers say it's this. Sometime later, we have better spy satellite pictures, or we have human intelligence that confirms that what the remote viewer said is true. And this, in a sense, is why the value of remote viewing for intelligence was seen, you know, it works. It's not perfect, doesn't work all the time, but it worked often enough.
What was one of the more unusual targets that had you thinking for the longest amount of time after the data was in?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. Of course, there were the formal ones, the ones that were tasked me as a government remote viewer, and some of those were pretty interesting. The USS Stark, the tasking was, and I didn't know what the tasking was, obviously. I just get my little coordinate, my little number, right? The tasking, the intended tasking, was report on what's going to happen in the next few days that would be utmost important for us to know about. Okay, that was the intent of the tasking. I get the number, I write down the number, I start describing this thing. First I perceived it as a metallic structure, and then I realized, oh, this metallic structure is in the water and it's moving. Of course, that means it's a vessel of some sort. So I'm starting to describe this vessel, and it really gave me a strong impression that it was a destroyer of some sort, and I had the impression it was an American destroyer. But I laid that off to the side as mental noise, and I just continued to describe it in generic terms. A large moving metal structure that seemed to be a warship of some sort. At night, moving in a closed body of water, sand on all sides, and then I also then perceived this aircraft flying some distance away, and at some point the aircraft drops these two cylindrical objects that emit this roaring, guttering noise, and they're long, thin, and have little stubby wings, and they fly around kind of aimlessly until at a certain point they and the vessel come together. And then I perceived smoke and yelling and fire and hoses on the deck, and people are consternated, and at some point this vessel leans to one side and it's all crumpled up and bent and all of that. And my monitor says, because he'd expected something else to come out of this, he said, "Oh, we better stop there." I said, "You're off, Paul. It's okay. No one's on all the time. We'll just take a break." And it was the weekend, and I went home. Monday morning, I get this phone call from Skip Atwater, from Fred Atwater, the operations officer. He says, "Hey, Paul, where's that session you did on Friday? Why do you care? I was off. I blew it." He said, "You haven't read the papers today, have you?" And so I go and find my copy of the Washington Post and open it up. The front page, U.S. frigate hit by Exocet missile fired by Iraqi jet. And I got a copy of the final after-action report of the Navy, and I had described that event perfectly. It's probably the best session I ever did then or since. I mean, it's such a rare thing that you do a perfect session that it's still fresh in my mind. But the fact was, 50 hours before that occurred, before the event actually occurred, I had described it in meticulous detail.
That's extraordinary.
It was. I was totally astonished.
If you did it right, you got it all. The way it sounded, the way it smelled. Those people were looking right up at you, begging you for mercy. It was like being God, but of course you're not God. Can't do a thing for them.
It's funny that the word Stargate is used to talk about this program, because actually that was just one small part of it. There were a lot of different parts of the program, each had its own code name. But there were two aspects. There was the operational aspect, where there were remote viewings going on real targets, and then there was the scientific program that was going on at SRI and later at SAIC. And they had a variety of names and were sponsored by a variety of agencies. And so this program just continued to find sponsorship from a variety of government agencies. And so it was a continuous 20-year program of scientific research and of operational remote viewing.
I checked once with all the guys that had been on the project when it was just used for intel, finding gun runners, drug lords, Soviet missile sites, even the Iran hostages. Anyway, I checked with them, they're all okay. But the five of us, plugged into the brains and nervous systems of human beings, that's when we lost it. We're all either dead or institutionalized.
Is there ever any danger to the remote viewer? Is it possible that you can go so deep into a target that it can screw your head up or just...
I think it's possible for someone who is already a bit unbalanced, if they remote view, to pick up a disturbing situation. Vice cops, if they hang around it too long, they end up acting like the people that they're trying to arrest. They start dressing like them, talking like them, and they even start developing the same attitudes. And so I could see where someone who habitually remote viewed, bad actors, could potentially start to develop some of those thought patterns that would lead them to, I won't say necessarily lead them to do something wrong, but at least lead them to develop negative sorts of attitudes and feelings and experiences in that respect. And let's say you had someone who remote viewed regularly serial killers and got to that level in remote viewing them. I think you could see some negative influence potentially build up in their lives. Their thought patterns might start kind of emulating that, and it could be a negative experience.
After a while, those conversations about the Yankees became impossible.
Basically, Orion is a weapon. He's like a guided search and reconnaissance and information gathering weapon. Unfortunately, he's not a computer, he's not made of metal and fiber optics and plastics. He's made of flesh and blood, and therefore creating a human weapon will bring its terrible human costs.
Yeah, if someone were, let's say, to remote view serial killers, we presume all serial killers are pretty messed up, and I think it's safe to presume that. And not just remote view them to some degree, but let's say enough so they pick up intentions and attitudes, emotions, and things like that, which is possible in remote viewing. You can't, I won't say you can't, but you don't normally really read someone's mind, certainly not in the Hollywood sense. You never read someone's mind in the Hollywood sense where you're actually knowing every thought and everything. But you can definitely pick up on emotions and feelings and impressions and intentions and those kinds of things.
I think people are terrified that remote viewing might be real or that we might possess the kinds of abilities that are shown with remote viewing. I actually teach a class in parapsychology, and so I get a chance to discuss this with my students, and most of them are really frightened by what it might mean. We value our privacy, and so if remote viewing is real, I think people worry that their privacy might be invaded. We also value our ways of knowing things, and right now our ways of knowing things wouldn't allow for this.
In 1995, program was disbanded, but it's quite a remarkable occurrence that a group of researchers had continuous government support for tens of millions of dollars spanning more than 2 decades. So one of the most paranormal things about our program is that we had continuous support from some of the most tight-fisted people in the U.S. government doing ESP research for that lengthy period of time.
Is remote viewing something that is still being used in the intelligence community?
Well, I'll give you the only answer I know the answer to. I mean, that I think I know the answer to, and that is I don't think it is. There's a slight caveat here. I think individual FBI agents, CIA agents, may indeed go to remote viewers as an alternative way of obtaining information just to see if it works. Because quite frequently, someone doing that has a contingency fund that they're allowed to pay sources with if they think there's at least a chance that it might prove valuable.
This was simply one more method that could be used in the intelligence business to get information in a way that was not available by any other means. And from purely like a completely rational decision when you're in the intelligence business, your goal is to find out things. This provided a new channel. That's why it persisted. That's why there was research on it. That's why the likelihood is that it is still going on. It just may not be going on in the way that it used to.